June 11th, 1944, 27,000 feet above Mersburg, Germany. The sky was a brilliant blue canvas painted with contrails from dozens of B-17 flying fortresses of the 91st Bombardment Group as they approached their target, the vital Lohne synthetic oil refineries. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hargrove, commander of the 323rd Squadron, checked his watch and nodded with satisfaction. They were 3 minutes ahead of schedule, and the German flak batteries hadn't yet found their range. He believed this mission might actually go smoothly. Perhaps the Luftwaffe was finally weakening after months of devastating losses. He would soon discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a desperate improvisation by American fighter pilots became one of the most psychologically devastating tactics against the Luftwaffe, shattering not just German aircraft, but the entire mythology of aerial superiority that German fighter pilots had built their identity upon. The morning had begun like countless others for Hauptmann Klaus Weber of Jagdgeschwader 3. At 26, Weber was already a veteran with 57 confirmed kills, most earned on the Eastern Front before being transferred to Reich defense duties in early 1944. His Me-109G gleamed in the morning sun as ground crews performed final checks. Weber sipped the ersatz coffee, a poor substitute made from roasted barley, and studied the intelligence report. American bomber formations were expected over central Germany, targeting the fuel production facilities that were now Germany's most critical vulnerability. "Another day hunting the Yankees," said Lieutenant Hans Baumann, Weber's wingman of 3 months. At just 20 years old, Baumann represented the new generation of Luftwaffe pilots, technically proficient but with significantly less training hours than their predecessors. "We'll add to your score today, Herr Hauptmann." Weber nodded, though without sharing the young pilot's enthusiasm. "Remember the briefing. Strike fast. Break away immediately. These P-51s aren't like the Russians. Don't get drawn into extended dogfights." Across the English Channel, Captain James "Dusty" Rhodes of the 357th Fighter Group climbed into the cockpit of his P-51D Mustang. Named Caroline's Revenge after his fiancée back in Nebraska, the fighter had been with Rhodes through 17 combat missions. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Mike O'Malley, helped secure his harness. "She's in perfect shape, Captain," O'Malley said, patting the aircraft's fuselage. "Full tanks, guns cleaned and loaded. 880 rounds for the 650s. Rhodes nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Mike. She's a beauty." The relationship between pilots and their ground crews was sacred. Lives depended on the meticulous work of men like O'Malley, who treated each aircraft as if their own son would be flying it. At the briefing an hour earlier, Colonel Henry Jackson had outlined the mission parameters. "Gentlemen, today we're escorting the 91st and 381st Bomb Groups to Mersburg. Intelligence reports increased Luftwaffe activity in the sector. They know we're hitting their fuel supply, and they're getting desperate." Rhodes and his fellow pilots had studied the maps and photographs of the target area. The 357th would be flying close escort for the bomber formations, while other fighter groups would sweep ahead to clear the approach. By June 1944, the strategy for daylight precision bombing had evolved significantly from the devastating losses of 1943. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang with its unprecedented range had changed the equation entirely. Major William Wild Bill Harkins, the squadron commander, added a crucial detail. "Intelligence suggests the Germans are employing new tactics. They're focusing on bomber formations when our fighters are drawn away. Stay disciplined and maintain position unless absolutely necessary." Rhodes settled into his seat, going through his pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. His eyes caught the small photograph of Caroline he'd taped to the instrument panel. Next to it was a tally sheet, 17 small crosses representing confirmed kills, 3 probables. He wasn't a glory hunter, but like most fighter pilots, he kept precise count. Across the airfield, First Lieutenant Raymond Wilson prepared his own Mustang. At 22, Wilson was one of the youngest pilots in the squadron, but already had 11 confirmed kills. His aircraft, Daddy's Disappointment, reflected his strained relationship with his father, a strict Baptist minister who had opposed his son's enlistment. "Hey, Dusty," Wilson called across to Rhodes as ground crews pulled away the wheel chocks. "First round at the pub is on whoever scores today." Rhodes gave a thumbs up as his Merlin engine roared to life, drowning out any further conversation. The powerful V12 engine produced over 1,500 horsepower, giving the Mustang both exceptional speed and range, the perfect combination for escorting bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. One by one, the P-51s taxied to the runway, taking off in pairs and forming up at 5,000 feet before setting course for the rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea. In total, 64 Mustangs from the 357th would participate in the day's mission, part of nearly 800 fighters escorting 200 heavy bombers in one of the largest air operations of the war to date. As they climbed to altitude, Rhodes checked his oxygen system and surveyed the formation. The Mustangs were arranged in flights of 4 aircraft, with each flight positioned to maximize visibility and mutual protection. Radio discipline was strict. Unnecessary chatter could alert German radar operators to their approach. Back in Germany, Hauptmann Weber led his staffel of 12 Me-109s to altitude, joining a larger formation of fighters from JG-3 and JG-27. In total, nearly 150 German fighters were being vectored toward the incoming American bomber stream. Weber noted with concern the fuel gauge already showing 3/4 full. Fuel restrictions meant they would have less than 30 minutes of combat time before needing to return to base. German radar operators had detected the massive formation of Allied aircraft crossing the Dutch coast. Coded messages were relayed to the defending fighter units, providing continually updated vectors. The strategy was to concentrate forces for a massive, coordinated attack that would overwhelm the American escort fighters and allow the German pilots to tear into the vulnerable bomber formations. At 25,000 feet, Weber's formation received final confirmation of the enemy's approach. Below them, the German countryside stretched out, still largely untouched by war compared to the devastated cities of the Ruhr Valley. Weber checked his gun camera one final time and addressed his pilots over the radio. Jagdgeschwader 3, maintain formation until visual contact. Remember your training. Attack from above, make a single pass, then climb away. Conserve ammunition and fuel. The reality of Germany's deteriorating position in the air war was evident in these instructions. Gone were the days of free hunting and extended aerial combat. Now, survival and efficiency were paramount. At 10:42 a.m., the opposing forces made visual contact. From the American perspective, the German fighters appeared as tiny specks against the blue sky, rapidly growing larger as they approached head-on. Colonel Jackson's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Looks like 109s and 190s. Blue squadron, maintain bomber escort. Red and yellow squadrons, engage!" Rhodes, part of Blue Squadron, watched as 24 Mustangs peeled away to intercept the incoming Germans. The remaining American fighters tightened their formation around the bombers, which continued steadily toward their target, flying in precise combat boxes that maximized their defensive firepower. Weber observed the American response with a trained eye. "They're splitting their force," he noted to Baumann, "exactly as expected. Schwarm 1 and 2, follow me. We'll bypass their interceptors and strike the bombers." The sky erupted into chaos as the first German and American fighters clashed. the distinctive sound of 50 caliber machine guns mixed with the sharper report of German 20mm cannons. Aircraft twisted and turned in deadly ballet, leaving contrails that marked their desperate maneuvers. Rhodes maintained position near the lead bomber element, scanning constantly for threats. His experienced eyes caught the movement before most. A group of Me-109s had slipped past the initial engagement and were positioning for an attack on the bomber formation. He keyed his microphone. "Blue leader, this is Blue 3. Bandits at 9 o'clock coming in fast. Looks like they've broken through." "Roger, Blue 3. Take your element and intercept. The rest of us will maintain close cover." Rhodes signaled to his wingman, Lieutenant David Cohen, and the two Mustangs peeled away from the formation, pushing their engines to maximum power to intercept the incoming Germans. Weber led his swarm in a textbook approach, diving from above and behind the bomber formation where the defensive gunners had limited coverage. He selected a B-17 on the edge of the formation and lined up his shot carefully. The American bomber loomed large in his gun sight, its olive-drab fuselage marked with a distinctive white J in a circle, the insignia of the 91st Bomb Group. Just as Weber was about to fire, his instinct screamed a warning. He broke hard right, rolling his aircraft almost inverted as tracers flashed through the space he had occupied a split second earlier. A P-51 Mustang screamed past, so close that Weber could see the pilot's oxygen mask and the aircraft's nose art. "Baumann, brake right!" Weber shouted into his microphone, but the warning came too late. The young pilot had been focused on his own attack run and failed to spot the intercepting Americans. Rhodes' first burst caught Baumann's Me-109 in the cockpit and engine compartment. The German fighter shuddered, trailed black smoke, then rolled inverted and plunged toward the earth 25,000 feet below. Weber felt the familiar surge of anger and grief that accompanied the loss of a comrade, but suppressed it immediately. Emotion was a luxury combat pilots couldn't afford. He banked sharply, seeking to re-engage, but the Mustangs were already turning to face him, and Weber knew his 109 couldn't match the American fighter in a turning battle at this altitude. "Swarm, disengage and climb," he ordered, pushing his throttle to maximum and pointing his nose upward. The Me-109 supercharger whined as it struggled to maintain power in the thin air. Weber knew the Mustang could follow him. Unlike earlier escort fighters, the P-51's performance at high altitude was exceptional. His only advantage was his experience and the slightly better climbing ability of his aircraft. Rhodes watched the German fighters climb away and made a quick calculation. Pursuing them would take him too far from the bombers he was tasked with protecting. Blue 3 to Blue leader. Bandits retreating, returning to formation. Roger. Blue 3, good work. As Rhodes and Cohen returned to the bomber stream, the first flak bursts appeared around the formation, black puffs of smoke that signaled their approach to the target area. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Merseburg were among the most formidable in the Reich, with over 280 TM guns guided by precise radar systems. Inside the lead B-17, Bombardier Lieutenant Frank Martinez peered through his Norden bomb sight, making minute adjustments as they approached the initial point. "Pilot, 5 degrees right," he instructed over the interphone. "Steady, steady." The bomber formation maintained its course despite the intensifying flak. This was the most vulnerable phase of the mission. They could neither evade the anti-aircraft fire nor break formation without compromising the bombing run. Weber had regrouped his remaining fighters and received new instructions from ground control. The flak batteries would cease fire at a predetermined time, creating a window for the fighters to attack as the bombers made their bomb run. This coordinated tactic had proven effective in previous engagements. "We'll come in from 6 o'clock high," Weber instructed his pilots. "Target the trail elements first. They often have less experienced crews." This was another hard-learned lesson. The lead bombers typically carried the most experienced personnel who guided the entire formation. At precisely 11:07 a.m., the flak around Merseburg suddenly stopped, creating an eerie silence. Seconds later, Weber led his fighters in a diving attack on the bomber formation. Simultaneously, other German units converged from different angles, creating a massive coordinated assault. Rhodes saw the attack developing and immediately responded. "Blue Squadron! Bandits 6 o'clock high! Break and engage!" His Mustang rolled inverted and pulled into a tight dive, aiming to intercept the German fighters before they reached the bombers. What happened next would become a turning point in the air war over Germany. As Weber closed on his target, a B-17 slightly separated from its formation, he suddenly noticed a P-51 approaching on an intercept course. But instead of firing from maximum range, the American fighter continued closing at tremendous speed. Weber recognized the danger too late. The Mustang wasn't attempting a firing pass. It was on a collision course. Lieutenant Raymond Wilson had made a split-second decision that defied conventional aerial tactics. With his guns jammed after the initial engagement and facing a German attack on the bombers he was tasked to protect, Wilson chose the only option he believed would work, a deliberate ramming attack. Weber broke hard, but the Mustang adjusted its course. Pilot clearly committed to the desperate tactic. The American fighter's wing sliced through the Mi-109's tail section, sending both aircraft into uncontrollable spins. Weber fought with his controls as his fighter tumbled through the sky, the airframe shuddering violently as aerodynamic forces tore at the damaged structure. The other German pilots watched in shock as their experienced leader's aircraft disintegrated. The American pilot had ejected the canopy of his damaged Mustang and managed to bail out, his parachute blossoming against the blue sky. Weber was not so fortunate. His aircraft's damage prevented the canopy from jettisoning properly. This single act of aerial sacrifice changed the dynamics of the entire engagement. The German pilots, witnessing what appeared to be a deliberate ramming tactic, hesitated in their attacks. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. "Did you see that?" Feldwebel Kurt Meyer radioed to his comrades in disbelief. "The American rammed Weber deliberately." Rhodes, who had witnessed Wilson's desperate maneuver, understood immediately the potential tactical advantage. He keyed his microphone. "All blue elements, press the attack aggressively. Get right on top of them before firing." The remaining German pilots, momentarily disoriented by the loss of their leader and the unexpected American tactic, found themselves suddenly on the defensive. Several broke off their attacks on the bombers, unwilling to risk being targeted for ramming. Colonel Jackson, commanding the entire fighter escort, recognized the shift in momentum. "All squadrons, push your attacks, drive them back from the bombers." The remaining German fighters, facing determined American opposition and confused by what they perceived as a new tactic of deliberate ramming, gradually disengaged. The bomber formation completed its run over Merseburg, dropping 500-pound bombs with reasonable accuracy despite the chaotic aerial battle raging around them. As the bombers turned for home, trailing smoke from damaged aircraft but with relatively light losses, Rhodes searched the sky for any sign of Wilson. He spotted a parachute drifting down toward German territory and made a quick note of the position. Allied intelligence would relay this to resistance networks that sometimes managed to rescue downed airmen. That evening, at RAF Leiston, where the 357th was based, the debriefing session took an unexpected turn. Colonel Jackson had received reports from multiple pilots about Wilson's apparent ramming attack. "It wasn't planned, sir," Rhodes explained. "Wilson's guns had jammed. I think he just made a split-second decision." Major Harkins, who had led Yellow Squadron during the mission, leaned forward with interest. Intentional or not, you all saw what happened to the German formation afterward. They broke off rather than press their attacks. Colonel Jackson nodded thoughtfully. Intelligence reports from other groups suggest similar incidents. When our boys get desperate, sometimes they resort to ramming. The psychological effect on the Germans appears significant. This observation would prove prophetic. Although the Allies never formally adopted ramming as a tactic, rumors began to circulate among Luftwaffe pilots that American fighters would deliberately ram German aircraft if necessary to protect their bombers. This perception, however inaccurate, created a psychological advantage that influenced subsequent engagements. 3 weeks later, on July 7, 1944, Rhodes led his flight on another escort mission, this time to Munich. The intelligence briefing that morning had included a remarkable piece of information. Intercepted Luftwaffe communications showed German fighter pilots were being specifically warned about American ramming tactics. "Apparently, they think we're all crazy enough to crash into them," Major Harkins told his pilots with a wry smile. "I'm not suggesting any of you actually try it, but if the Germans want to keep their distance, I won't complain." The mission to Munich encountered strong Luftwaffe resistance, but Rhodes noticed something unusual. When his Mustangs pressed aggressive attacks, closing to unusually short distances, the German fighters often broke off rather than maintain their position. They were clearly wary of the perceived ramming threat. After returning to base, Rhodes recorded his observations in his combat log. "Enemy fighters appear increasingly reluctant to press home attacks when we aggressively close distance. This gives us a significant tactical advantage in breaking up their coordinated assaults on bomber formations." Meanwhile, at Luftwaffe headquarters, the apparent American tactic was causing serious concern. General Major Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, addressed the issue in a staff meeting with senior Luftwaffe commanders. "We have multiple reports of American fighters deliberately ramming our aircraft," Galland stated, reviewing the intelligence summary. "This represents a level of fanaticism we did not anticipate from the Americans. It was a tactic we sometimes saw from the Russians on the Eastern Front, but not from Western pilots." Oberst Heinrich Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 220 victories, offered his analysis. "The Americans have unlimited resources. They can afford to lose fighters to destroy ours because their production capacity far exceeds ours. For every aircraft they lose in a ramming attack, we lose both an irreplaceable plane and, more importantly, an experienced pilot." The statistics supported this assessment. By mid-1944, American factories were producing fighter aircraft at a staggering rate. Over 4 Zewa P-51 Mustangs would be built that year alone. Germany, by contrast, was struggling to maintain production despite constant bombing of its factories. Even more critical was the pilot situation. American training programs were graduating thousands of new pilots monthly, while German training had been severely curtailed due to fuel shortages. This disparity created a perception among Luftwaffe pilots that their American counterparts were willing to embrace sacrifice tactics because of their material advantage. What had begun as a desperate improvisation by Lieutenant Wilson had evolved into a powerful psychological weapon. Back in England, Lieutenant Raymond Wilson's fate remained unknown until August 1944. When intelligence channels reported remarkable news, he had survived. After parachuting into German territory, Wilson had been captured but managed to escape with the help of French resistance fighters. After 2 months evading German patrols, he had finally reached Allied lines following the Normandy invasion. Wilson's return to the 357th Fighter Group was celebrated with appropriate ceremony. Colonel Jackson presented him with the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions over Merseburg. "I never intended to ram him, sir," Wilson admitted during the ceremony. "I was closing to fire when my guns jammed, By then I was too close to avoid collision. It wasn't heroism, just bad luck turned good." Jackson smiled. "Intended or not, Lieutenant, your action had far-reaching consequences. Intelligence reports that German fighters now give our formations a wider berth when we press aggressive attacks. They think we're all willing to ram them if necessary." Wilson looked surprised. "They believe that's an actual tactic, sir?" "Perception becomes reality in war, Lieutenant. The Germans lost over 2 Zeuseren fighters in May and June alone. Their remaining pilots are increasingly cautious, especially when faced with tactics they don't understand. The statistical impact was indeed significant. Analysis of combat reports showed that Luftwaffe interception effectiveness against bomber formations decreased by approximately 17% in the months following the Merseburg raid. While multiple factors contributed to this decline, including fuel shortages and mounting pilot losses, the psychological element couldn't be discounted. Hauptmann Klaus Weber survived his emergency landing, but suffered severe injuries that ended his combat career. During his recovery at a military hospital near Munich, he recorded his thoughts in a journal that would later be discovered by American intelligence officers. "The Americans have changed. Early in the war, their pilots lacked experience and could be outmaneuvered by our veterans. Now they fly with an aggression and determination that matches or exceeds our own." The willingness of American pilots to sacrifice themselves through ramming attacks demonstrates a level of commitment we did not expect from them. This war is no longer merely about skill or tactics. It has become a contest of production and will. In both areas, I fear we are now at a disadvantage. Weber's assessment reflected the changing reality of the air war. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the strategic air battle. Despite the introduction of advanced aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter, Germany could not overcome the combined challenges of fuel shortages, training deficiencies, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The psychological impact of perceived American ramming tactics represented just one factor in this decline. But it illustrated a broader truth about aerial warfare. The psychological dimension often proved as important as technical capabilities. German pilots, who believed American fighters might deliberately ram them, approached combat differently, often breaking off attacks earlier and maintaining greater separation distances that reduced their effectiveness. In December 1944, Rhodes was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. During a Christmas Eve gathering at the Officers' Club, he raised a toast to the absent Lieutenant Wilson, who had been reassigned to a training unit back in the United States after completing his combat tour. "To Ray Wilson," Rhodes said, holding his glass high, "the man who convinced the Luftwaffe that American pilots are all crazy enough to ram them head-on." The room erupted in laughter and applause. The story had become part of fighter group lore, embellished with each retelling until it achieved almost mythical status. After the war, military historians would study this phenomenon as an example of psychological warfare emerging organically from battlefield improvisation. What began as a desperate act by a single pilot evolved into a perceived tactical doctrine that influenced enemy behavior. The Luftwaffe never fully adapted to the combined challenges of Allied numerical superiority, aggressive fighter escort tactics, and the psychological uncertainty created by incidents like Wilson's ramming attack. The final statistics tell the story clearly. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had destroyed over 11 Zeuseren German aircraft, 500 in air-to-air combat, and 900 on the ground. American production delivered over 15 Zeuseren P-51 Mustangs during the war, while Germany struggled to replace losses as its industrial base crumbled under Allied bombing. For pilots like Rhodes and Wilson, these statistics represented more than numbers. They reflected countless individual moments of courage, sacrifice, and sometimes desperate improvisation. The myth of American ramming tactics, born from necessity rather than design, demonstrated how psychological factors could amplify material advantages in the crucible of combat. In his post-war memoir, Rhodes reflected on that pivotal mission over Merseburg. "We never trained to ram enemy aircraft. No sane pilot would deliberately attempt such a maneuver, yet the Germans came to believe we would do exactly that to protect our bombers. This perception gave us an advantage that no technical superiority could match. The psychological edge that comes when your opponent believes you're willing to go further than they are to achieve victory. In aerial combat, as in much of war, what the enemy believes about you can be as important as what is actually true. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.